Well, turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis, chapter 46, verses 5 through 7. We're going to pick up where we left off last time. Now, hopefully you've been coming on a regular basis, so I don't need to do any type of review. If you haven't been coming on a regular basis, don't worry about it. And the reason I say don't worry about it is because you're not going to get too lost. And the reason you're not going to get too lost is because we're going through the story of Joseph. And I don't care whether you grew up in church or not, most of us have heard the story of Joseph. So you shouldn't be too lost, even though you're coming in at the very end of the story. And I shouldn't say the very end. We're getting close to the very end of the story. Anyways, follow along with me as I read verses 5 through 7. So Jacob left Beersheba, and his sons took him to Egypt. They carried him and their little ones and their wives in the wagons Pharaoh had provided for them. They also took all of their livestock and all of their personal belongings they had acquired in the land of Canaan. So Jacob and his entire family went to Egypt, sons and grandsons, daughters and granddaughters, all of his descendants. Now, if you remember, Jacob had stopped at Beersheba in order to offer sacrifices unto God. And the reason he did that is because he was afraid of going to Egypt. And he wanted confirmation that this was the right thing to do. So after he offered these sacrifices, he had a vision in the night. And God appeared to him and told him, don't be afraid of going to Egypt. And then he revealed his plan for Jacob's descendants. And the last thing he told him was, you will die there. In other words, this is going to be a permanent relocation for you. And because of what he revealed, also for your descendants, at least for a period of time. So with confirmation from God that this was the right thing to do, Jacob and his family loaded up all of their personal belongings and they headed to Egypt. Now, if you remember, Pharaoh told Joseph's family to leave their personal belongings behind because he would give them everything they needed. But they didn't do that because Jacob knew that this wasn't a temporary relocation, but it was going to be permanent, at least for 400 years. After which time they would leave Egypt to go back to Canaan. Look again at Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 14, because I want you to understand something about the Bible. The Bible builds on itself. And if you don't have a good understanding of the Bible, many times when you're reading a story, it doesn't make sense. But the reason it doesn't make sense is because it's building on material that was already presented. If the Bible had to continually go over the same things, we would have volumes and volumes of the Bible. But we're able to take God's Word and put it in one book. And if you think about it, this is really a little book. But here's the drawback. You have to understand it all because the revelation is progressive. It builds on itself. So we have to go back to Genesis 15 and look at the promise that God made unto Abraham and what he told him, because what's happening with Jacob actually deals with this. So look at Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 14. Then the Lord said to Abram, who told his son Isaac, who passed it on to Jacob, which made Jacob afraid to go to Egypt until God reassured him. Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. They will spoil them, and that's exactly what happened. God delivered the Israelites, and remember, it's named after Jacob. God changed Jacob's name to Israel, so his descendants became known as the Israelites, and the nation is referred to as Israel, which is Jacob's God-given name. So God delivered the Israelites from the bondage of Egypt, and they became a great nation, and Canaan became their homeland, and it has been promised to them forever. Now, verses 8 through 27 is a genealogical list of the people who traveled with Jacob to Egypt. And normally I spend a lot of time on genealogies because I'm kind of weird. I've told you that before as we've been going through Genesis. I like genealogies. And the reason I like genealogies is because there's a lot of information that's given that most people don't realize. So I normally spend a lot of time on genealogies, but not this time. And the reason I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this genealogy is because the only reason this genealogy is given is because the author wants us to know the number of people who went to Egypt with Jacob. And from this group of people, the nation of Israel is going to be formed. So we're more interested in the number of people who went to Egypt than who these people were. And that's usually not the case. Normally, we're interested in who these people were, but not this time. We're more interested in how many went to Egypt than who these people were. Does that make sense? So let me point out a few interesting tidbits, and then we're going to move on. This particular genealogy has 6 parts to it. It begins with an introduction in verse number 8, and then the sons of Jacob by Leah are listed in verses 8 through 15, or the last part of 8 going all the way to verse 15, followed by the sons of Jacob by Zilpah, and that's found in verses 16 through 18, and then the sons of Jacob by Rachel in verses 19 through 22, and last but not least, the sons of Jacob by Bilhah in verses 23 through 25, and then the genealogy ends with a summarizing statement that gives us the number of male descendants that went to Egypt with Jacob. Now, we're told that there also were daughter-in-laws, granddaughters, great-granddaughters, but the women are not counted. All we're going to count are the male descendants of Jacob, those who went with him to Egypt. And that number is 70, including his descendants that were already living in Egypt. And who would that be? Joseph and his sons Manasseh and Ephraim. So that number that ends up being in Egypt, who are the beginning of this great nation that God is going to build, is 70. Look at verse 27. In addition, Joseph had 2 sons who were born in Egypt. So altogether, there were 70 male members of Jacob's family in the land of Egypt. So Jacob and his family went to Egypt with a grand total of 70 male family members. And the story in Exodus is going to pick up from this point on. See, we're getting very close to the end of Genesis. The 50th chapter is the last chapter in Genesis, and then Exodus begins. Now remember, God has already told Abraham that his descendants are going to spend 400 years in this foreign nation as slaves. So how long of a period do we have from the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus? 400 years. And they're almost silent years. And how much time passed between the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, to the coming of Jesus? 400 years. You see, God likes patterns. In fact, to the Hebrew mind, pattern is prophecy. Now, we don't speak that way in our Western culture. We talk about types and antitypes, but it's the same thing. Pattern is prophecy. So we are going to end the book of Genesis with Joseph, the story of Joseph and Jacob's children. This is the beginning of this nation and how they went to Egypt. And then we're going to pick it up in Exodus chapter 1, 400 years later. In fact, look at Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. These are the names of the sons of Israel. That is Jacob. There's the God-given name. It's Israel, not Jacob. From this time on, we're going by Jacob's God-given name. Who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. These are the tribes of Israel. And all Jacob had 70 descendants. We just read that in this genealogy. That's an important part. He had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there, and his 2 sons. In time, Joseph and all his brothers died, ending the entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful, and they filled the land. All of Egypt? No. What land is it referring to? The land of Goshen. We're going to find out, even though that's part of Egypt, it's not included as the main part of Egypt. It's almost like its own. Kind of like Puerto Rico is to us, who wants to become the 51st state. But anyways, in fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful, and they filled the land. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. So we're going to start off with this new story of the Exodus, but there's this gap. So when we finish Genesis, we come to Exodus. we have to pick the story back up, even though 400 years, or about 400 years, has passed. So the main point of this genealogy is not so much who went down to Egypt, but how many went down to Egypt, because we're interested in how this nation began, how God chose Abraham, and then promised him a son, Isaac, who then had 2 sons, but Jacob was chosen, and from Jacob's children, God formed this new nation. They were to be his chosen people. Now, why are they his chosen people? Does God love them more than he loves us? No. So why are they God's chosen people? Because the seed of the woman is going to come through this nation. That seed of the woman will bring salvation to all, and the seed of the woman is Jesus Christ. So everything we teach, everything we preach is all about Jesus. And it doesn't matter if I go to the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, or all the way to the New Testament, the book of Revelation. People, it's all about Jesus. It's all about the history that's going to bring the seed of the woman who's promised to bring salvation. And then in the New Testament, it's all about the person who was the seed of the woman who brought salvation and how we apply it to our life. Everyone with me? Now look at verses 28 through 30. We just finished from verse 8 to verse 27. You thought I was long-winded, but I finished that many verses. As they neared their destination, Jacob sent Judah ahead to meet Joseph and get directions to the region of Goshen. And when they finally arrived there, Joseph prepared his chariot and traveled to Goshen to meet his father Jacob. When Joseph arrived, he embraced his father and he wept, holding him for a long time. Finally, Jacob said to Joseph, "Now I'm ready to die, since I have seen your face again, and I know you're still alive." Now, Jacob was always a very wise person. He wasn't this wimp, this mama's boy that your Sunday school teachers told you about. Not at all. In fact, when he was a men of the tent, what it simply meant was he was very wise and very responsible, and we talked about that. And everywhere that Jacob went, he was very, very blessed. But the reason he was blessed is because he was very wise. And he didn't want to step on anyone's toes when they entered Egypt. So what he did was he sent Judah on ahead to get specific directions, not only to Goshen, but where in Goshen they were supposed to go, which was a very wise thing to do, because if they had driven all of their flocks and their herds into Goshen and to an area that was used by another shepherd, it would have caused problems. And Jacob was always thinking ahead and trying to avoid trouble, so what he did was he sent Judah ahead of him to go talk to Joseph to say, "We're coming. Now, where do we need to go exactly so we don't offend everyone when we bring all of our herds and all of our flocks in?" Well, when Judah gets there, Joseph doesn't wait. He doesn't tell him. Joseph goes in there and he just hooks up his chariot and off he goes. And the reason he did that is because he couldn't wait for his father to arrive. And it was a sweet reunion between him and his father. And it was really a tearjerker. And they stayed embraced for a very, very long time until basically, and this is the way the Hebrew language actually says it, until they were cried out. Now look at verses 31 through 34. And Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's entire family, "I will go to Pharaoh and I will tell him, 'My brothers and my father's entire family have come to me from the land of Canaan. These men are shepherds and they raise livestock. They have brought with them their flocks and herds and everything they own.' Then he said, 'When Pharaoh calls for you, and he will, and he asks you about your occupation, here's what you must tell him. We, your servants, have raised livestock all of our lives, as our ancestors have always done. When you tell him this, he will let you live here in the region of Goshen, for the Egyptians despise shepherds.'" Now, Goshen was where Joseph wanted his family to settle, but Pharaoh hadn't yet said where they could settle. So what Joseph did was he coached his brothers on what to say when they came before Pharaoh. You see, the Egyptians considered shepherding an abomination. They despised shepherds. And the reason they did is because shepherds were a lower class of people. Now, let me explain why they were a lower class of people, why they were despised, and why shepherding was considered to be an abomination. Because if you don't understand this, you don't understand why Joseph wanted his family to be in Goshen and how they could hang on to this monotheism religion for 400 years in the midst of a pagan nation. So let me explain why shepherds were despised and it was considered to be an abomination. Egypt is a desert nation. When I say desert, I'm talking about sand. In fact, when I traveled to Egypt, I was looking out of the window as we were going over to the Mediterranean Sea, and when we came to land, all you could see was just sand. Until all of a sudden, right in the middle of the sand, it's like houses appeared, and it was very green, and this river flowed in the middle of these houses. And that river that was flowing was the Nile River. Now, Egypt, as I said, is a desert nation, except where the Nile River flows through it. In fact, along the Nile River is wonderful farmland. And it still is wonderful farmland. Because when the Nile flooded, it brought in rich topsoil from Central Africa and mainly from Ethiopia, and it deposited it along the banks of the Nile River. In fact, the word Egypt literally means black dirt or black soil. So, in the biblical times, Egypt did not refer to what we consider to be modern-day Egypt. When we look at Egypt on a map, we go, boy, that's a big country. But people don't live out in the desert. There's no water there. It's all sand. Sandstorms come, and if you built a house, it would cover your house. Most of us don't realize that many of the artifacts that have been found in Egypt happened because a sandstorm would come, and all of a sudden something would be revealed, and you thought, I didn't even know it was there. Why didn't you know it was there? Because it was covered with sand. So the only part that was actually used were the parts that the Nile flowed through on each side of the river, and it only went for a little bit. And only that was considered to be Egypt. Now, because the land alongside the Nile River was great farmland, you didn't allow farm animals or any flock of animals to graze on it. Does anyone know why? Well, it's because there wasn't that much of it. So it was reserved for farming and farming only, no livestock. So all of Egypt's livestock were kept in the Goshen area. But that meant that the shepherds were isolated from the rest of Egypt. So only the lower class of Egyptians were shepherds. And because they were isolated from the rest of Egypt, it also meant that they were isolated from the Egyptian temples and the religious rituals, so they couldn't partake of the religious customs and rites. They couldn't participate in the worship of the Egyptians' gods. So they weren't religious at all, which made shepherding, in the eyes of the Egyptians, an abomination. Why was it an abomination? Because they didn't worship the Egyptian gods. They didn't carry out the customs in the culture, or the customs in that culture at that time. So shepherds were despised. Think about it. If you couldn't go to any of the temples or participate in any of the religious rites, you couldn't worship the Egyptian gods, even if you wanted to. So eventually, you wouldn't be religious at all. Pretty soon, you lose all of that. And that's why the Egyptians despised shepherds and considered shepherding to be an abomination. The reason they considered it to be abominations is because it kept you from worshiping the Egyptian gods and participating in the religious rites. Now let me ask you a question. Why weren't any of the temples or the cities built in the area of Goshen? Because that's the delta. The Nile River separates into 7 different places, and it really flooded there, and there wasn't any place very stable to build any of these magnificent places. So the area of Goshen was considered to be a part of Egypt, but it was also considered not to be a part of Egypt. Does that make sense? It was isolated from the customs and the culture of the Egyptian people. Now, Joseph didn't want his family settling among the Egyptians in central or southern Egypt because they were polytheists and idolaters. And he knew if his family didn't worship as the Egyptians worshiped, it would cause problems. Because from the Egyptians' point of view, not worshiping their gods was an abomination. So in their eyes, it would have been inexcusable for Joseph's family not to participate. So Joseph is in this predicament. He wants his family to come, but he realizes if my family comes and they're plopped down here in central or southern Egypt, they're not going to be able to worship the Egyptian gods because my family believe in the only one true God. And when the Egyptians look at my family and say, why are you not worshiping our gods? They're going to think it's an abomination. So what does Joseph do? He says, that won't happen in Goshen. So I have got to manipulate the Pharaoh to make sure that my family lives in Goshen where they're able to worship the only true God and not the Egyptian gods. Does that make sense? Because the Egyptian shepherds that were living in Goshen weren't religious at all. They were despised by the Egyptians. Shepherding was an abomination. So it was like, we don't want any of that. So they couldn't have cared less how Joseph's family worshiped. And that's why Joseph wanted his family to settle in Goshen. People is all about freedom of worship. Now, let me fill this in because most of us don't think in chronological order. We need to remember, they believed in Yahweh. They believed in the one true God. He had revealed himself to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Jacob had passed it down to his sons. But the Mosaic sacrificial system wasn't implemented until when? God delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt and at Mount Sinai. So they don't have a temple or a tabernacle. They're not sacrificing. They just believe in the one true God. And from time to time they would sacrifice, but not as a whole nation, but as individuals. And it was in private. Does that make sense? So, before Joshua presented his family to Pharaoh, he had to coach them on what to say to make sure they landed in the region of Goshen. If they said they were shepherds, then Pharaoh wouldn't let them settle in central or southern Egypt because that was reserved for farmland and farmland only. The only place you could raise your flocks and herds of animals was in Goshen. And that's where Joseph wanted them to settle. So Joseph coached his brothers on what to say when Pharaoh asked about their occupation, because everyone does that. You know, if I'm introducing one of you to someone else, I'll normally, if it's a man, I don't do this for women, I don't know why, but men have the tendency to identify themselves with what they do. Think about it. If you were introducing me to one of your friends, you would say, "This is Allen Nolan, he's the pastor of my church." If I'm introducing Ryan Baird, I say, "This is Ryan Baird, he's a chiropractor." See, we have the tendency to do that. And it's always been that way. Why? Because it's God's plan that man provides for his family. A man that doesn't work is worse than an infidel. That's just the way it is. If you don't work and you have the ability to work, get off your tail and start working. That's a shame. That's an embarrassment. And it's been this way forever. So Joseph knew that when he presented his family to Pharaoh, what's Pharaoh going to do? He's going to ask, "What's your occupation? What do you do?" So he coaches them on what to say. Look at verses 1 and 2 in chapter 47. Finish with chapter 46. Then Joseph went to see Pharaoh and told him, "My father and my brothers have arrived from the land of Canaan. They've come with all of their flocks and herds and possessions, and they are now in the region of Goshen." Joseph took 5 of his brothers with him and presented them to Pharaoh. Now, I want you to notice how Joseph steered the conversation in the way that he wanted it to go. Here's what he told Pharaoh. "My family has arrived in Egypt, and they brought their flocks and their herds with them, and they've camped in the region of Goshen." Now, do you see how smoothly he worked that all in? My family's here with lots of flocks and lots of herds, and they've camped in Goshen. He did that so Pharaoh would naturally think, "Oh, they're shepherds. And we don't allow livestock to graze in our farmland." Why? Because there's not enough of it. And what there is of it is great farmland. There's just not enough of it. So the livestock are going to have to stay in the area of Goshen. So do you see how smooth Joseph was in planting the idea in Pharaoh's head that Joseph's family needed to live in Goshen? Pretty smooth. This is why Jacob, who was very wise, chose Joseph to be the bearer of the birthright. Because Joseph just had wisdom. Then Joseph picked 5 of his brothers to go before Pharaoh. Look at verse number 2 again. Joseph took 5 of his brothers with him and presented them to Pharaoh. He took the 5 best who were wise enough to say what they needed to say, but also wise enough not to say something they shouldn't. And that's how he picked the 5. We don't know which 5 they were, but that's the 5 that he picked. Now, look at verses 3 through 4. And Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" Oh, yeah. Joseph saw it coming. First thing he's going to ask. He's bringing in the men. "What do you do for a living?" They replied, "We, your servants, are shepherds, just like our ancestors. We have come to live here in Egypt for a while, for there's no pasture for our flocks in Canaan, because the famine is very severe there." So please, we request permission to live in the region of Goshen. Man, they stayed right on script. They stated their occupation, and then they asked Pharaoh if it would be possible for them to live in Goshen. Now, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but they didn't ask for permanent residence. Did you notice that? They didn't ask for that. They said, we have come to live in Egypt for a while. Look at verse 4 again. We have come to live here in Egypt for a while. The King James Version says, we've come to sojourn, which means to stay temporarily. So Jacob's sons didn't intend on staying forever. Jacob knew it was going to happen. Joseph probably knew that it was going to happen, but the brothers still hadn't bought into it. We're just here temporarily. But the truth is, they found out that things were so good in Goshen, they didn't leave when the famine was over, which was part of God's plan. Now, 400 years later, God's going to bring them out of Egypt and back to Canaan. But I just wanted you to see that the brothers hadn't quite bought into it, and they didn't intend on staying permanently, just temporarily. Now, look at verses 5 and 6. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, now that your fathers and brothers have joined you here, choose any place in the entire land of Egypt for them to live. Give them the best land of Egypt. Let them live in the region of Goshen. He just negated everything he said before that. Now, you have to understand something. Ambassadors do this. They're promised the world, but give you this. So take the best that there is, but live in the land of Goshen because you're shepherds. But that's everything that Joseph wanted. And if any of them have special skills, in other words, they know how to breed stock, then put them in charge of my livestock too. So Joseph got what he wanted. His family would be able to live in Egypt, but they would also be in Goshen, which would allow them to worship the one true God and not the Egyptian gods without offending the Egyptians. And people, this is very, very important, and you must understand this. If you don't realize that Joseph is trying to manipulate the Pharaoh, he's trying to get his family to live in Goshen, you don't understand a very important point in the book of Genesis and Exodus. Here's the point. Even when a new Pharaoh came into power and forgot what Joseph had done, the Israelites were still allowed to worship the one true God, and they weren't forced to worship the Egyptian gods. Why? Because the land of Goshen was separated from central Egypt and southern Egypt, where all of the temples were and all of the religious rites were performed. The priests never went to Goshen. They always stayed in central and southern Egypt. And if they would have been in central or southern Egypt, they would have been expected to worship the Egyptian gods, and if they hadn't, they would have been stoned. That's very, very important, because when you get to the story of Exodus, it begins to make sense when Moses asked for certain things. How could God send this to Egypt, but it seemed to stop? It only happened in central and southern, but in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were, none of those plagues come upon them. And isn't that interesting? Now, again, those in Goshen were allowed to do what they wanted, no one cared. And that explains why Israel was allowed to keep their own religion in the land of Egypt for 400 years without stirring up problems, even when new pharaohs came into power. Look at Exodus chapter 1. Let's read verses 7 through 10. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty. I don't know if you noticed this. This is kind of like building on top of each other. They increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty. Wow. And the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Now most of us don't understand what this is saying. They became so mighty that what he was afraid is that another nation would come in, and they would join with that other nation, defeat Egypt, and then just claim Goshen as their own, and actually annex it away from Egypt. Now, eventually, the way they're going to stop this is they're going to turn them into slaves. But during this process, Egypt begins to grow so much more because they've got free labor. So then it becomes a point where they don't just want them to turn away with the Egyptians. They don't want them to leave Egypt because we have all this free labor. Now, remember They're allowed during this time to worship the one true God, but the sacrificial system, the Mosaic sacrificial system, has not been instituted yet. It's not instituted until they are delivered from Egypt, and it's given to them at Mount Sinai. And that's very important. And let me show you why. When we get to the book of Exodus, go to the 8th chapter. Let me read verses 25 through 27 and show you something. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles if you don't mind. This is not coming up on the screen. Notice what it says. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. All right, go ahead and offer sacrifices to God. He said, but do it here in this land. But Moses replied, that wouldn't be right. The Egyptians detest the sacrifices that we offer to the Lord our God. Look, if we offer our sacrifices here where the Egyptians can see us, they will stone us. We must take a 3-day trip into the wilderness to offer sacrifice to the Lord our God, just as he has commanded us. So God is giving revelation still during this time, but there's no temple. So they're only offering as families, but now they want to do it corporately. But here's what's interesting. Pharaoh says, well, go ahead and do it in the land of Goshen. He says, we can't do that because you've turned us into slaves. Now you have Egyptians that are down here and they're overlords. And when they see us offering sacrifices to the one true God and not to the Egyptian gods, they're going to stone us. No, we can't do that. But see, you don't understand that unless you've read through the book of Genesis. Now, look back at Genesis chapter 47. We're going to continue on. And let's read verses 7 through 10. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. Now, I'm not going to go into this, but this is a great Sunday morning sermon. Because the book of Hebrews talks about the patriarchs and how they saw themselves as pilgrims. In other words, they were sojourners on this earth. The promises that God had given them, they realized would not be fulfilled in their lifetime. So they were looking for a city that was built not with hands, but was built eternally by God. And that's how we're supposed to be as Christians. People, we're to be looking for the Lord's return and also realizing that this is just, compared to eternity, a second in our life, this time here on earth. And Jacob had that mentality, but that's not what I want you to see. What I want you to see is when he was asked how old he was, he said, I'm 130. So Jacob was 130 years old when he went to Egypt, and he lived to be 147. Now, I want you to notice what Jacob said about his life. Look at verse number 9 again. And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. He told Pharaoh that his life had been short and difficult. Now, 130 might not seem short to you because we feel like we've lived a good long life if we reach 90, right? And if you make it to 100, wow. But he said, my life has been short because he thought at any time he would die. He lived another 17 years. God granted him, if you remember, Joseph had 17 years, and then he was taken into captivity. God gave him another 17 years with Joseph. But he didn't die till he was 147. But he thought he was going to die when he went down to Egypt. He wouldn't live very long. So he said, my life has been short. And 130 might not seem short to us, but Abraham, his grandfather, lived to be 175. You'll find that in Genesis 25:7. His father, Isaac, lived to be 180. That's in chapter 35, verse 28. So in comparison to his father and his grandfather, his life had been short. And even when he died at 147, he never lived to the age that his father and grandfather did. But I want you to notice what else Jacob said about his life. He said it had been difficult. Now wait a minute. This is God's chosen man to bear these children who are going to be the patriarchs of the nation of Israel, the chosen people. But Jacob says, my life has been difficult. King James Version, I believe, says evil. And it was, people. Esau caused him trouble. Laban caused him trouble. Rachel and Leah caused him trouble. And his children caused him the major trouble. Dinah disobeyed. She wasn't supposed to go out. She wasn't supposed to associate with the Canaanite women because it was a very promiscuous society. So she was supposed to stay in the camp, but she had gotten out, had gotten to know some of the Canaanite women, and she started associating with them. And so one day, when everyone was busy, she snuck off. And if you remember, she was raped. And she was held captive. So Simeon and Levi retaliated by killing all the males in Shechem, which forced Jacob to have to move. Reuben slept with one of Jacob's concubines. 10 of his sons sold Joseph into slavery and then told him that he was dead. To be honest with you, it was his family that caused him the most heartache. So saying that his life had been difficult was really an understatement. But that doesn't mean that he didn't love his family or he didn't enjoy life. People, he did. He just realized that he was living in a sinful world, and because he was living in a sinful world, others can cause us grief. Because the truth of the matter is, very seldom did Jacob cause his own grief. A few times, but it was usually others. And let me just tell you something about life. Because God has created us to be a family and to join together and to minister to others. And even in the church, we see each other supposedly as brothers and sisters, though many of us don't do that. We're supposed to. But let me just tell you, because we live in a sinful world, it's others who are going to hurt us. And that's what happened. You see, sometimes it's not what we do, it's what our family does that causes us the most heartache. Have you ever noticed that? And that was true for Jacob. And I kind of wonder how his children felt when he comes before Pharaoh, and I'm sure his 5 brothers were still there, and he asks how old he is. I'm 130, and he says, my life has been short and difficult. And he's limping because that hip that had been displaced by Jesus Christ in the Christophany, he's limping, he looks old, he's wrinkled, and he says, my life's been difficult. And the boys are back there, and they're going, you know, we really screwed up Dad's life. And what's sad is many times we get to the end of our life and realize we screwed up other people's lives. But I want you to understand something. It didn't mean that Jacob didn't enjoy life. He just recognized a fact. And we have to realize that. People are going to stab you in the back. People are going to do things that you don't approve of. People are going to hurt you. But that doesn't mean life isn't good. And I've told you that as we go through this life, we're supposed to look at all these things that happen to us in the scope of eternity. And when we do that, it really doesn't matter. Those things are trivial. Big deal. And that's what Jacob was able to do. Now, look at verses 11 through 12, because I'm going to hurry through this. So Joseph assigned the best land of Egypt, the region of Ramses, to his father and his brothers, and he settled them there just as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided food for his father and his brothers in amounts appropriate to the number of their dependents, including the smallest children. So Joseph's family settled in Goshen, also known as the region of Ramses. Now, this has caused a lot of confusion with scholars, and let me explain why. Ramses wasn't alive during that time period or before that time period. The period of Ramses was much later. So how could the land of Goshen be known as the land of Ramses if he was much later in history? Anyone know? Well, this is an anachronism. An anachronism is the placement of an event, person, or thing out of its proper chronological order. In other words, as if the person or event existed before it really did. Let me give you an example to illustrate what anachronism is. If I said, when the Pilgrims first came to the United States of America. Did you catch that? Now wait a minute. That's an anachronism because technically there was no United States of America when the Pilgrims came. That came later. But you know what I mean. I mean that when the Pilgrims first came, they came to this land that's now known as the United States of America. It wasn't known as the USA back then, but it is now. That's an anachronism. So, by the time that Moses wrote the book of Genesis, the land of Goshen had come to be known as the region of Ramses, which has helped archaeologists to come in and begin to define when these pharaohs ruled. People, you don't realize this, This book has helped archaeologists more than any other book because it's been found to be true. And what's great about it is when they use it, they find things that they never thought they would find, but it's just like the Bible said it was. And that's why Moses referred to this as the region of Ramesses. It's an anachronism. Now, I hope you notice that even the food that Joseph provided to his family had to be rationed. Remember, Joseph's family went to Egypt sometime during the second year of the famine, which meant that there were 5 more years to go. This was going to be a 7-year famine. So the food had to be rationed even with Joseph's family, and that's what verse number 12 is saying. Look at verse 12 again. And Joseph provided food for his father and his brothers in amounts appropriate to the number of their dependents, including the smallest children. Tough times call for tough measures. And Joseph didn't treat his family any differently than he treated everyone else. He was extremely fair in the way he dealt with people. No corruption whatsoever. And that's the way we're supposed to be. And that speaks volumes of Joseph. And we're going to stop here because of time, but also because verse number 13 starts a new section.